The trade war, tariff war between the US and China is now underway. It began at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Standard Time, 1 minute past 4 our time, so about an hour 20 ago, and it will last until when? The initial sum is relatively small. Tariffs are being imposed on $34 billion of Chinese imports, but the rhetoric is bellicose and the sums involved may get very, very large. And then what? Beijing has said it will respond. The US has said it will respond to their response. Deborah Elms is the head of the Asian Trade Centre in Singapore. I spoke to her a short time ago about a standoff that seems to have no obvious solution.
Yes, yeah, and that's where it gets very complicated. I mean, we've never been in a situation like this, so it's a little unclear how this ends. And I think the difficulty from, someone who's been watching this for quite some time is there is no obvious off-ramp. Normally, when you impose something like a tariff, it's at the end of negotiations, and the negotiations have failed, and so you impose a punishment. We've got this upside down and backwards, where we're imposing the punishment ahead of the negotiations. And so how do you then negotiate after you've imposed a punishment is unclear.
Yes, even as you say that, I try and make sense of this situation, and it's impossible to do so. The question is, where does President Trump stop? And if we look at this rather extraordinary conversation he had with reporters on Air Force One, he's talking about tariffs on goods of up to $500 million, which are currently being held in abeyance, his word. And that doesn't seem to be the end of it. He is already escalating.
Yeah, well, I mean, the escalation goes from the $30+ billion to $50 billion. That comes in about 2 weeks because the U.S. changed its original $50 billion list a little bit after they had public hearings and discussions about that because they swapped out a few things on the list, and they needed to give sufficient time for the customs authorities in the U.S. to be prepared for these new items. So there's definitely an escalation coming in about 2 weeks as another 16 or so billion dollars comes into effect. The question is what happens after that? Does it go from the 30 billion plus 16 billion to an additional 200 billion to an additional who knows what? Or does it stop, and at what point does it stop? I mean, I think that's where we really are in murky waters.
We are. What's a win look like here? What does a win look like for President Trump? What's his end game?
Well, I think one of the reasons why this is so complicated to imagine the end is that he and his group of advisors all have different views on what the end looks like. For Trump, it looks like he wants a reduction in the tariff deficit vis-a-vis the United States. For some of his advisors, they want a fundamental restructuring of the Chinese economy, and they especially want a restructuring of the Made in 2025 initiative in China. That is both of those goals are difficult, but restructuring the Chinese economy, of course, is extremely difficult, and getting the Chinese to renounce Made in 2025, I think, is going to be impossible. So somewhere in between there, you have to decide what is the end goal, and then how would the Chinese actually meet that if they wanted to do so. And I think that's why it's so difficult to imagine how this ends, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, the Chinese said, we want this to be done today, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes. They're not sure what that would look like. Okay, we're ready to end. Fantastic. Now what? Nobody seems to even know who do you call, who do you talk to, what would you have to do. And I think that is where people who expect this to end quickly are terribly misguided.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it's hard to imagine how it even ends at all. You are at the Asian Trade Centre, and of course, New Zealand is down the bottom of that region, and we very much, since Prime Minister Jim Bolger, have seen ourselves as part of Asia. What does it mean for trading nations in the wider Asian region and in the world, who are not directly involved in this at all, but who will inevitably be, at some level, collateral damage?
Well, I think it's a sort of good news, bad news thing. On the bright side, for countries like New Zealand, what it has done is it's dramatically escalated the enthusiasm for alternative arrangements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So good news for New Zealand is that we thought it might be difficult to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership through some countries like Canada, and as a result of Trump's trading policies, Canada has escalated their ratification procedures, and it should be done even in Canada by early next year, which is much faster than I had originally anticipated. So we're stabilizing the global economy in other areas that will be beneficial for a place like New Zealand. On the flip side, though, the collateral damage can be significant. The U.S. market remains a very important driver of global growth, and if that market stops functioning as it has for 70 years as a stabilizer for the world, then that presents all sorts of challenges. And if the global trading regime as a whole, which we have counted on to make sure that trade continues to function, and if that stops, then that is deeply problematic for all of us. So it's a sort of good news, bad news thing, and the question is how far does this whole assault on the trading order go before the U.S. administration pulls back or is reined in, and by whom?
That is the question. Deborah Elms, who is Executive Director of the Asian Trade Centre. So the tariff war, the trade war, is now formally underway. I spoke to Deborah just before we came on air.